On a cold morning in the spring of 1940, a German patrol moving through a quiet stretch of the French countryside heard something that stopped every one of them in their tracks. It was not gunfire, it was not the rumble of tanks or the drone of aircraft overhead. It was music, thin, wailing, unmistakable, the sound of bagpipes drifting across a field where no living thing had any business making music. And then, from behind a low stone wall, a man rose to his feet. He wore the uniform of a British officer, but slung across his back was a longbow, and at his hip hung a Scottish broadsword that belonged in a museum, not a modern battlefield. He notched an arrow, drew it back, and let it fly. The German soldier who fell that day earned a strange and lonely distinction. He became, as far as anyone can prove, the last enemy combatant in recorded history to be killed by an English archer using a longbow in battle. The man who fired that arrow was named John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. His friends called him Jack. His enemies, when they lived long enough to speak of him, called him something else entirely. And the men who fought beside him gave him the name that would follow him for the rest of his life. They called him Mad Jack. But the nickname tells you almost nothing about who he actually was, and that is the first mistake most people make about him. It is easy to hear about a man who charged into the deadliest war in human history, carrying medieval weapons, and assume he was a lunatic, a reckless fool who somehow stumbled through the fighting on luck alone. That version of the story is simpler, and it is wrong. Jack Churchill was not confused about what century he was living in. He knew exactly what a rifle could do. He had one. He simply believed that a man who went into battle without a sword was, in his own words, improperly dressed. Behind the theatrics was a soldier of genuine skill, a leader men would follow into places no sane person wanted to go, and a mind that operated on a logic all its own. To understand why he did the things he did, you have to understand the man beneath the legend, and that man is far stranger and far more impressive than the cartoon that history sometimes reduces him to. He was born in September of 1906 in Colombo, in what was then British Ceylon, into a family that moved often and gave him the kind of restless, wandering childhood that tends to produce people who never quite fit the mold. His father worked in the colonial service, and the family's travels carried young Jack across the far corners of the empire before eventually depositing him back in Britain. He attended the Royal Military College at Sandhurst and was commissioned into the Manchester Regiment in 1926. By all appearances, he was headed for an ordinary military career, the kind that ends quietly with a pension and a modest rank. He served in Burma. He rode a motorcycle across the length of India, some 500 miles of it, largely for the sheer pleasure of the experience, navigating roads that were barely roads at all, and crossing terrain that would have deterred anyone less determined to see what lay on the other side of it. He was thrown from the machine more than once, picked himself up and carried on, treating the whole ordeal as an adventure rather than the hardship it plainly was. And then, in 1936, having grown bored with the slow rhythms of peacetime soldiering, he did something almost no career officer would ever dream of doing. He resigned his commission and walked away from the army entirely, trading the security of a guaranteed future for the open uncertainty of civilian life, with no clear plan for what would come next and no anxiety about the lack of one. What he did next reveals more about him than any battlefield story ever could. He picked up a set of bagpipes and taught himself to play well enough that he competed in the military piping championships at Aldershot and placed second among dozens of pipers. He became a serious archer, so accomplished with a bow that he represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships held in Oslo in 1939. He worked for a time as a male model, his sharp features and lean frame apparently suited for the role. He appeared as an extra in films, and in at least one of them he can be glimpsed on screen, an archer in the background, doing on camera the very thing he would later do in earnest against the German army. This was not a man drifting aimlessly. This was a man collecting the exact set of unique skills that would, entirely by accident, make him one of the most memorable soldiers of the coming war. He could not have planned it, no one could have, but when the world caught fire again in 1939, Jack Churchill was uniquely, bizarrely prepared. He returned to the army the moment war broke out, rejoining his old regiment as though he had never left. And it was during the retreat toward Dunkirk, in that grim and chaotic period when the British Expeditionary Force was being driven back toward the sea, that the legend truly began. Near the French village of L'Épinette, Jack and a small group of men set up an ambush against an advancing German patrol. He gave his men a signal, and the signal was not a shouted order or a raised hand. He told them he would open fire first with his bow, and that the sound of his arrow finding its target would be their cue to attack. When the moment came, he rose, drew, and loosed. The arrow struck a German soldier in the chest. It was, by any measure, an act that should not have been possible in the age of the machine gun, and yet it happened, witnessed by the men around him, a moment so improbable that it has been retold ever since as the last confirmed longbow kill in the history of European warfare. There is a detail here that matters because it separates Jack Churchill from the merely eccentric. He did not carry the bow and the sword as props. He carried them because he had thought carefully about the psychology of combat and reached a conclusion that most soldiers never consider. A man being shot at by a rifle experiences fear, but it is a familiar fear, one he has been trained to expect and endure. A man being charged by an officer swinging a broadsword and screaming, backed by the wail of bagpipes, experiences something far worse. He experiences confusion layered on top of terror. His training gives him no answer for it. His mind stalls, searching for a response to a threat that has no place in his understanding of war. And in that half-second of hesitation, Jack Churchill won. His weapons were tools of shock, and shock, he understood, could be more devastating than firepower. The madness was a method. He had spent years studying the bow and the blade, not as curiosities, but as instruments, mastering them to a degree that let him use them with real intent when the moment demanded it. A lesser man carrying the same weapons would have been dead within minutes. Jack survived because his eccentricity was welded to a hard core of genuine ability, and the men who dismissed him as a mere showman tended to be the ones who had never actually watched him work. The bagpipes announced him, the sword finished the argument, and between those two extremes lay a soldier who had thought more carefully about the nature of fighting than almost anyone around him. After Dunkirk, an ordinary soldier might have counted himself lucky to have survived and settled into the long grind of the war. Jack did the opposite. He volunteered for the Commandos, the newly formed units built specifically for raids behind enemy lines, for the most dangerous and unconventional operations the British could devise. It was, in every sense, the perfect home for a man like him. The Commandos did not want soldiers who followed the rulebook. They wanted men who could improvise, who could function in chaos, who possessed the peculiar blend of courage and creativity that ordinary warfare had no use for. Jack Churchill was practically their patron saint. In December of 1941, he took part in Operation Archery, a raid on the German-held island of WWII off the coast of occupied Norway. As the landing craft approached the shore under fire, Jack stood at the front, and rather than shouting orders or crouching for cover, he raised his bagpipes and played. The tune he chose was called The March of the Cameron Men, and he piped it as the boats scraped ashore and the bullets came in. The instant the ramp dropped, he tossed a grenade and charged into the fighting, sword drawn, leading his men up the beach and into the town. The image is almost impossible to believe, and yet it is thoroughly documented by the men who were there. A British officer wading into a live battlefield with a broadsword in one hand and the sound of the pipes still hanging in the air behind him. What his men remembered afterward was not the strangeness of it, but the effect. The piping steadied them. It told them, in a moment when fear could easily have taken hold, that their commander was calm enough to make music, and if he was calm, then perhaps the situation was survivable after all. There was a purpose buried inside the spectacle, as there almost always was with Jack. For his conduct at WWII and earlier at Dunkirk, he was awarded the Military Cross, the first of the decorations that would eventually mark him as one of the most honored irregular soldiers of the entire war. But it was in the mountains of Yugoslavia and Italy that Jack Churchill's war reached its most extraordinary peak.
By 1943, he was commanding a commando unit in the fighting across the Adriatic and through the brutal terrain of the Italian campaign. He led an assault on a heavily defended German position on a hill designated Point 622 near Salerno. The attack was ferocious, and by the time it was over, Jack found himself in a situation that would have broken most men. Nearly his entire force had been killed or captured or scattered. He was left almost alone, surrounded by the enemy, in the dark, with his men fallen around him. What he did then has passed into legend. He walked among the German positions, and he began to play his bagpipes. The eerie sound, coming out of the darkness from a place it had no reason to be, so unnerved the German soldiers that when they finally captured him, they did not immediately kill him. They took him prisoner, this strange, piping ghost of a man, and in doing so, they kept alive one of the war's most improbable figures. His actions on that hill earned him the Distinguished Service Order, and later a bar to it, marking him twice over for gallantry of the highest order.
Captivity for most soldiers meant the end of the war. For Jack Churchill, it was merely an inconvenience to be overcome. The Germans, uncertain what to make of a prisoner who shared a surname with the British Prime Minister, initially suspected he might be related to Winston Churchill himself. He was not, though he never went out of his way to correct the misunderstanding, and the confusion may well have kept him alive. He was shipped to the notorious Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a place ringed with guards and wire and every deterrent the Germans could devise, a place from which escape was considered very nearly impossible. Jack found it possible. Together with another prisoner, he located an old drain that ran beneath the perimeter, and in September of 1944, the two men worked their way through it and slipped away into the surrounding countryside. They moved by night and hid by day, pushing toward the Baltic coast in the hope of finding a way out, and Jack covered a considerable distance before he was spotted and taken again, dragged back into captivity, but not, it turned out, for long. Undeterred, he was later moved to a camp in Austria, and when the guards' attention lapsed during the chaotic final months of the war, he simply walked out and kept walking. He covered something close to 150 miles on foot through hostile territory, alone, until he encountered an armored unit and at last made it back to Allied lines. Most men, having escaped a concentration camp, survived Dunkirk, led charges with a sword, and been decorated repeatedly for valor, would have felt that they had done more than enough. The war in Europe was, by that point, nearly finished, but Jack Churchill was not a man who believed there was such a thing as enough. He traveled to Burma to join the fight against Japan in the Pacific Theater, hungry to be in the thick of it once more. He arrived to discover, to his open and genuine dismay, that the atomic bombs had been dropped and Japan had surrendered. The war was over. He is said to have remarked with complete sincerity that if it had not been for those Americans, the fighting could have gone on for years. It was the complaint of a man who had found in the deadliest conflict the world had ever known something that felt to him like purpose, and who was not ready to let it go.
And here is where the story turns, because a man defined so completely by war might be expected to fall apart when peace finally arrived. Many did. The transition from the intensity of combat to the quiet of ordinary life has destroyed countless soldiers who survived everything the enemy could throw at them, only to be undone by the silence that followed. Jack Churchill was not undone. He simply pointed his restless, relentless energy in new directions. He trained as a paratrooper, earning his wings at an age when most men were thinking about slowing down. He served in Palestine in the late 1940s, where during one incident, he led a small group in an attempt to relieve a besieged medical convoy, once again placing himself between danger and the people he felt responsible for protecting. He discovered surfing and became one of the first people to ride the tidal wave known as the Severn Bore on the river near his home in England, building his own board and pursuing the sport with the same total commitment he had brought to everything else. He grew fascinated by the ancient craft of building model warships. In his later years, he took a peculiar delight in startling fellow train passengers by hurling his briefcase out of the window as the carriage rolled along, and he would sit back, unbothered, as the other travelers stared in alarm. He had thrown it, he later explained, into his own back garden, saving himself the trouble of carrying it home from the station. Even in retirement, the logic was entirely his own, unbothered by how it looked to anyone else. It would be easy to file all of this under simple eccentricity, to laugh at the briefcase and the bagpipes and the sword and leave it there. But that would be to miss what makes Jack Churchill genuinely worth remembering. Underneath every strange choice was a coherent philosophy, even if he never spelled it out in those terms. He believed that fear could be weaponized, that the unexpected could shatter an enemy more effectively than overwhelming force, and that a man should meet the world on his own terms rather than the terms handed to him. He was not brave in the way we usually mean the word, the gritted teeth endurance of a man doing his duty despite his terror. He seemed, by every account of those who knew him, to be genuinely unafraid, to move through danger with a lightness that unsettled the people around him almost as much as it unsettled his enemies. Whether that was a gift or a kind of blindness is a question worth sitting with. A man who cannot feel fear is not necessarily wise, and there is a version of Jack Churchill that never made it home, one where the arrow missed, the charge failed, the gamble came up short, and the legend died on a beach or a hillside before anyone had a chance to hear about it. He was lucky, and he would likely have been the first to admit it. But luck alone does not carry a man through Dunkirk, 2 escapes from captivity, and campaigns across 3 theaters of a global war. Something else was at work. Some rare fusion of nerve and skill and sheer refusal to be intimidated, and whatever we choose to call it, it made him very often unforgettable.
The soldiers who served under him did not follow him because he carried a sword. They followed him because he was, beneath the spectacle, extraordinarily good at keeping them alive and winning the fights he chose. The theatrics were real, but so was the competence, and it is the combination of the two that makes him so difficult to categorize. Strip away the longbow, and you still have a highly decorated officer who fought with distinction across multiple theaters of the war, escaped captivity twice, and was awarded the Military Cross and the Distinguished Service Order with a bar. Add the longbow back in, and you have something that history simply does not produce very often. A man who took the most modern and mechanized war ever fought and insisted, successfully, on fighting it his own ancient way. Jack Churchill died in 1996 at the age of 89 in England, having lived long enough to become a legend while insisting, in his characteristically understated fashion, that he had done nothing particularly remarkable. He tended to wave away the stories, uncomfortable with the mythology that had grown around him, as though charging a beach with a broadsword while playing the bagpipes were the sort of thing any reasonable person might do. That modesty is, in its own way, the final piece of the puzzle. He did not perform these acts for glory or for the attention of history. He performed them because to Jack Churchill they were simply the correct way to conduct himself. The rest of us see madness. He saw manners. There is a temptation, when looking back at figures like him, to assume they belong to a vanished world, that the conditions which produced a man like Mad Jack could never occur again. And perhaps that is true. The specific collision of empire and archery and warfare and pure individual stubbornness that created him is unlikely ever to repeat itself. But the deeper thing he represents is not so easily dismissed. He is proof of how much one single person, refusing to accept the limits everyone else takes for granted, can imprint himself on events far larger than himself. He did not change the outcome of the war. He was one man among millions. But of those millions, how many are remembered by name, their deeds retold nearly a century later by people who never met them and never could? Jack Churchill understood something that most people spend their lives failing to grasp. The world will try to tell you what is possible and what is not, what is sensible and what is absurd, and much of the time the world is simply wrong. He fought an entire war on that principle, and he was right often enough to survive it and to be remembered for it. So the next time the story comes up, the one about the Englishman with the sword and the bow and the bagpipes, resist the easy laugh. Or rather, laugh because it is genuinely funny, and he would not have minded, but laugh knowing that behind the joke stood a real man who made real choices under fire, who led real soldiers through some of the darkest fighting of the 20th century, and who did it all while refusing, absolutely and to the end, to be anyone other than exactly who he was. That is the thing worth taking from him. Not the sword, not the bow, the refusal.
In a century that asked everyone to become interchangeable, to blend into the vast machinery of nations at war, one man declined, and in declining, he made himself impossible to forget.